A billionaire handed his unlimited credit card to an elderly woman and her daughter in a shopping mall, then walked away without rules, without limits, without protection. Less than 24 hours later, a transaction notification appeared on his phone. It wasn't designer clothes, it wasn't a luxury hotel, it wasn't jewelry or expensive dinners. It was something that made his breath catch in his throat. In that moment, Jason Richardson realized the experiment he'd designed to test them had become a mirror reflecting something he'd spent decades refusing to see. And what came next would force him to confront a question that terrified him more than any business deal ever had. What if everything he believed about people had been built on a lie? Welcome to Elevate Stories. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel. When the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10 and share what you felt along the way. And if you enjoy emotional stories filled with unexpected choices and second chances, make sure to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. Now sit back, relax, and let's begin. Jason Richardson, age 41, had built an empire on one fundamental principle: trust no one until they prove they deserve it. As founder and CEO of Richardson Technologies, a venture capital firm managing $8.7 billion in assets, he'd watched brilliant ideas crumble because of human weakness, partnerships dissolved over greed, charities embezzled donations, friends revealed themselves as opportunists the moment money entered the equation. His penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan had floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city like a painting he owned but never truly saw. His closet held suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His watch, a limited edition Patek Philippe, marked time in a life where every minute had been optimized, leveraged, and monetized. Yet somewhere between his third billion and his fourth, Jason had stopped feeling anything resembling joy. His father's voice still echoed in his head during quiet moments, sharp and certain as a closing gavel. "Son, kindness without conditions is just weakness wearing a halo. The moment you show vulnerability, people will exploit it, especially those with nothing to lose. Desperation doesn't make people noble, it makes them dangerous." Jason had lived by that creed for 2 decades. Every act of generosity filtered through lawyers and non-profits. Every donation structured for maximum tax benefit and minimum personal exposure. He'd never once looked someone struggling in the eye and simply helped. Not without contracts, not without control, not without protecting himself first from the inevitable disappointment. But that Tuesday afternoon, something shifted in the machinery of his carefully controlled existence. He'd missed his connecting flight in Chicago and found himself stranded with 3 hours to kill before the next departure. His assistant had suggested the hotel lounge, but restlessness drove him into the glass and marble corridors of the magnificent Mile shopping district instead. Designer stores lined the walkways like temples to excess. Shoppers moved through them with the easy confidence of people who'd never had to choose between medicine and groceries. Jason's Italian leather shoes clicked against polished floors. His charcoal suit was custom-tailored in London. His phone vibrated constantly with messages from investors, partners, analysts, all demanding pieces of his attention, his judgment, his time. Then he saw them. Near a quiet seating area between a Burberry boutique and a high-end jewelry store sat an elderly woman and a younger woman, clearly together, clearly separate from the world of commerce surrounding them. The older woman, silver hair pulled back with careful dignity, coat clean but threadbare at the cuffs, sat with her spine straight, despite the weariness Jason could see in the delicate lines of her face. Her shoes were worn at the heels. Her hands, folded neatly in her lap, showed the kind of rough grace that comes from decades of work. The younger woman stood beside her, one hand resting protectively on the older woman's shoulder. Early 30s, Jason guessed. Tired eyes that had seen too much responsibility too soon. She wore simple clothes that had been carefully maintained, her posture holding a quiet strength that reminded Jason uncomfortably of his own mother before cancer took her. They weren't begging, they weren't asking, they were simply existing in a space where their presence felt like an apology. Jason stopped walking, his assistant, trailing 3 steps behind with her tablet and organized chaos, nearly collided with him. "Mr. Richardson, we have the quarterly reports to review before your 5 o'clock call with—" "Wait here," Jason said, his voice distant, disconnected from the urgency she represented. He approached slowly, expensive shoes carrying him across an invisible border between 2 worlds that occupied the same physical space but existed in completely different realities. Every logical part of his brain catalogued reasons to keep walking. This wasn't his problem. This wasn't his responsibility. Chicago had social services, shelters, systems designed to handle this. Except something about the older woman's posture stopped him cold. There was no performance in the way she held herself. No practiced desperation or rehearsed plea, just bone-deep exhaustion combined with a refusal to surrender dignity even when the world had surrendered her. When she noticed him approaching, she stiffened slightly, readying herself for judgment or dismissal. The younger woman met his eyes instead, calm but wary, protective instincts clearly honed sharp. "I'm sorry," the younger woman said before Jason could speak, her voice carrying the weight of too many apologies for simply existing. "We're just resting. We'll move if we need to." The automatic apology hit Jason harder than any quarterly loss ever had. "No," he said quietly, stopping a respectful distance away. "You're fine." He looked at the older woman, something in her bearing demanding respect, despite circumstances that should have stripped it away. "What's your name, ma'am?" She hesitated, decades of caution visible in the pause, then lifted her chin slightly. "Madam Doris." "And you?" Jason asked the younger woman. "Judy," she replied, her tone steady despite obvious wariness. "Judy Beverly." Something in the way Judy said it, without shame, without performance, made Jason pause. "Are you family?" Judy's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "She's my mother. Took me in when life didn't go the way I planned." Jason nodded slowly, recognizing the weight of untold stories in that simple statement. Years of reading people across boardroom tables had taught him when histories were heavy and private. He didn't ask more, didn't pry, just stood there, watching 2 women who'd somehow maintained grace under circumstances that would have broken him. His assistant cleared her throat impatiently behind him. "Mr. Richardson, the car is waiting. We really must—" Jason raised one hand, silencing her without breaking eye contact with Madam Doris. His father's voice whispered warnings. "The desperate will take everything. They can't help themselves. This is foolish." Maybe it was time to test that theory himself, to prove once and for all whether the cynicism he'd inherited had been wisdom or just fear dressed up as sophistication. Jason reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. Judy's eyes widened slightly, probably expecting $20 if they were lucky, maybe $50 if compassion felt generous. Instead, Jason removed a black credit card with platinum edges and no visible limit, the kind of card that opened doors most people didn't know existed. Madam Doris stared at it like he'd pulled out a live grenade. "Take it," Jason said, holding the card between them like a bridge across an impossible distance. "I don't understand," Judy stammered, instinctively stepping closer to her mother. "Sir, we don't beg." "I'm not offering charity," Jason said carefully, the words feeling strange on his tongue. "I'm offering trust." He placed the card directly in Madam Doris's palm. Her fingers were rough from work, cold despite the mole's climate control, trembling slightly as they closed around the plastic. 48 hours, Jason explained, his voice steady despite the chaos of doubt screaming inside his head. Use it however you see fit. No limits. No questions. No conditions. Madam Doris's eyes locked onto his, searching for the trick, the catch, the inevitable moment when kindness revealed itself as cruelty wearing a better mask. "This is too much," Judy said immediately, her voice tight with fear of owing something they could never repay. "Maybe," Jason admitted quietly. "But I want to know something. I want to see what someone who's lived a full life does when money finally stops being the problem." Madam Doris studied the card in her palm, then raised her gaze to meet his. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of decades. "If I accept this, young man, it won't be for foolishness." Jason smiled slightly despite himself. "I wouldn't expect anything less." "Why us?" Judy whispered, tears threatening at the corners of eyes that had probably cried themselves empty months ago. Jason looked at Judy, seeing the exhaustion of someone who'd been carrying weight alone for too long. He thought about his own mother, about sacrifice, about the invisible labor of love that held broken things together. "Because I'm tired of assumptions," he said honestly. "Because I want to believe there's still something good left in people who've been tested by circumstances I'll never understand. Prove my father right or prove him wrong. Either way, I'll finally know the truth." Madam Doris closed her fingers slowly around the card, the gesture carrying the gravity of accepting something far heavier than plastic. 48 hours, Jason repeated, stepping back. "There's no pin. Just sign your name. I'll return here Thursday afternoon. Same place, same time." His assistant looked physically ill. "Mr. Richardson, this is highly irregular. We should establish parameters, legal protections." "No parameters," Jason said firmly, his eyes still on Madam Doris. "No protection, just trust." The word felt foreign on his tongue. Trust. He'd spent 20 years avoiding it like a contagious disease. Madam Doris opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. She just held the card like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning, her entire body carrying emotions Jason couldn't begin to name. As Jason turned and walked away, his father's voice returned with vengeful certainty. "She'll drain your account. She'll disappear. You're a fool, Jason. A sentimental, naive fool who just learned the most expensive lesson of your life." Jason kept walking, expensive shoes carrying him away from the experiment he'd just set in motion, unsure whether he'd just witnessed the beginning of confirmation or the start of something that would unravel everything he thought he knew about human nature. But to understand why that moment mattered, why Jason Richardson, a man who'd spent 2 decades building walls around his wealth, would hand unlimited access to strangers, you have to go back 48 hours earlier to the luxury watch boutique in downtown Chicago where the first notification would arrive and the doubt would truly begin. That night, Jason Richardson did not sleep well. He told himself this was intellectual curiosity, not conscience. A simple experiment with measurable variables and predictable outcomes. Yet he found himself checking his phone with a frequency that bordered on compulsion. The glowing screen illuminating his penthouse bedroom at 11:47 p.m., then 1:23 a.m., then 3:16 a.m. Nothing. No notifications. No alerts. No evidence that the card existed anywhere except in Madam Doris's trembling hands. The silence felt louder than any transaction would have been. Jason threw back his Egyptian cotton sheets, thread count higher than most people's credit scores, and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. The city sparkled below him like a circuit board of human ambition, each light representing someone's hustle, someone's struggle, someone's attempt to matter in a world that measured worth in dollars and influence. He'd given away access to millions, to strangers, to people whose last names he barely remembered. What the hell was I thinking? His father's voice materialized in the darkness like smoke. You weren't thinking. You were feeling, and feelings make fools of intelligent men. Jason pressed his forehead against the cold glass, watching his breath fog the window. He'd spent 20 years building Richardson Technologies on the principle that human behavior was predictable when properly incentivized. People acted in their own self-interest, always. The moment you gave them power without accountability, they revealed their true nature. He'd seen it happen a dozen times before. There was Marcus Chen, the entrepreneur Jason had seed-funded after a compelling pitch about revolutionizing urban agriculture. 3 months later, Marcus was in Ibiza with Jason's investment money, posting Instagram stories from yacht parties while his company existed only as an expensive website. There was the youth mentorship program Jason had donated $200,000 to after a gala presentation moved him to rare generosity. 6 months later, an audit revealed the director had funneled funds into a personal real estate venture while the kids got pizza parties and motivational posters. There was his college roommate Derek, who'd asked for a temporary loan to save his family's home from foreclosure. Jason had written the check without hesitation, believing friendship meant something. Derek paid off his gambling debts instead, then stopped returning calls. Every act of unprotected generosity had become an expensive lesson in human nature's darker curriculum. So why should this be different? Jason returned to bed, but didn't close his eyes. His phone rested on the nightstand like a ticking bomb. He imagined Madam Doris in some hotel penthouse by now, ordering room service and laughing at the billionaire fool who'd handed her a blank check. He imagined Judy maxing out the card at designer stores, years of deprivation finally finding release in retail revenge. He imagined proving his father right one more humiliating time. At 7:12 a.m., his phone vibrated. Jason grabbed it so quickly he nearly dropped it, heart hammering against his ribs with an intensity that embarrassed him. A transaction notification glowed on the screen. Richardson Platinum Card, 4783, Millennium Grocery Mart. Jason stared at the numbers, waiting for them to make sense. $47 at a grocery store, not a luxury hotel, not a high-end boutique, not even a decent restaurant. Groceries. The relief Jason expected didn't come. Instead, confusion settled over him like fog. He pulled up the transaction details, as if more information would clarify what he was seeing. The timestamp showed 6:54 a.m. She'd been awake early, shopping practically. It's strategic, Jason's cynical mind offered. Small purchases first to avoid suspicion. The big spending comes later. But doubt crept in through the cracks of his certainty. Throughout the day, Jason moved through his professional obligations like an actor performing a familiar role. A board meeting about Q4 projections, a conference call with Tokyo investors, lunch with a senator who wanted Richardson Technologies to fund her education initiative, which Jason declined after his assistant's background check revealed 2 previous scandals involving misappropriated funds. Between every meeting, he checked his phone. 1:34 p.m., $23.67. Northside Pharmacy. 3:42 p.m., $156,100. Marshall Department Store. 5:18 p.m., $89.50. Comfort Medical Supply. The amounts were careful, deliberate. Nothing extravagant, nothing wasteful. The kind of spending that suggested someone thinking about necessity rather than desire, need rather than want. Jason found himself more disturbed by restraint than he would have been by excess. His assumptions had prepared him for 2 outcomes: complete inaction born from fear, or reckless abandon born from desperation. He'd theorized about both possibilities with his assistant over coffee that morning, laying out predictions like a scientist designing controls for an experiment. This middle path, this measured, practical, almost boring use of unlimited resources, didn't fit either model. That evening, Jason cancelled dinner plans and sat alone in his penthouse, laptop open to his credit card account, watching transactions appear like breadcrumbs through a forest he couldn't see. 7:45 p.m. $6,700, Bellevue family restaurant dinner. A modest dinner. With unlimited funds, they'd chosen a family restaurant. Jason's discomfort grew with each notification, not because his worldview was being confirmed, but because it was being gently, persistently dismantled. Every transaction whispered the same question. What if you've been wrong about people who have nothing? What if desperation doesn't corrupt? It clarifies. By the second morning, the pattern had crystallized into something Jason couldn't ignore. Healthcare items, warm clothing, practical shoes, modest meals. Nothing frivolous, nothing selfish. Nothing that confirmed the narrative he'd built his entire philosophy around. His father's voice had gone quiet. Jason stood at his window again, watching the city wake up, phone clutched in his hand like a rosary. Another notification arrived, 8:23 a.m., $250,000, Community Care Foundation. Jason's breath caught. A donation. She'd used his money to donate to a charity. The card had 23 hours left. Madam Doris could still prove him right, could still justify the cynicism, could still validate everything his father had taught him about trust being a luxury only fools could afford. But something in Jason's chest had shifted during those 48 hours of watching restraint where he'd expected recklessness, dignity where he'd anticipated greed. He grabbed his coat. "Cancel everything," he told his assistant over the phone, already heading for the elevator. "I need to go back." "Back where, Mr. Richardson?" "The mall," Jason said, surprised by the urgency in his own voice. "I need to see them again, now. Before the time runs out." Because somewhere between the first transaction and the 15th, Jason Richardson had stopped testing Madam Doris and started questioning everything he thought he knew about human nature, about poverty, about the stories we tell ourselves to justify keeping our wealth protected and our hearts closed. And he needed to know, before the 48 hours expired and the mirror his experiment had become shattered, whether redemption was possible for someone who'd spent 20 years being wrong. Jason found them in the same seating area where he'd left them 47 hours earlier, though everything about the scene had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. Madam Doris sat with the same straight-backed dignity, but the threadbare coat had been replaced by a warm, elegantly simple one in deep charcoal, quality without ostentation, warmth without excess. Her shoes were new, sensible, the kind designed for comfort rather than fashion. Her silver hair had been recently styled, simple and neat, framing a face that looked less exhausted, more present. Judy stood beside her mother, one hand still resting protectively on Madam Doris's shoulder, but the weight in her posture had lightened perceptibly. Her hair fell in soft professional waves. She wore a tailored jacket, nothing designer, nothing flashy, but clothing that fit properly, that announced capability rather than apology. A small shopping bag rested at her feet. They weren't hiding. They weren't performing. They were simply there, existing in the space with a quiet confidence that hadn't been present 2 days ago. Madam Doris spotted Jason first. She stood immediately, back straight, movements carrying the same careful grace he remembered. "Mr. Richardson." Jason stopped several feet away, suddenly uncertain. He'd rehearsed this confrontation during the 20-minute car ride, prepared speeches about accountability and expectations. But the words dissolved on his tongue as Madam Doris reached into her purse and pulled out his credit card. She crossed the distance between them, and pressed the card into his palm with steady hands. "We're returning this," she said simply. Jason stared at the black plastic, still warm from her possession. "You have 23 hours left." "We're done," Madam Doris said, her voice gentle but final. Judy stepped forward, pulling a small envelope from her jacket pocket. "We kept all the receipts." "We thought you'd want to see them." Jason's hands trembled slightly as he took the envelope. He'd expected many things: excuses, justifications, defensive explanations. He hadn't expected documentation. He opened it slowly, aware that both women were watching him with expressions he couldn't quite read. Not shame, not defiance. Something closer to quiet dignity awaiting judgment. The receipts were organized chronologically, each one smoothed flat and stacked with care. Millennium Grocery Mart, 47,083 tons. The itemized list showed vegetables, lean proteins, whole grains. Real food, not processed convenience. Enough for several nutritious meals. Northside Pharmacy, $23.67. Prescription refills. The medication names meant nothing to Jason, but the necessity was clear. Marshall Department Store, $156. 2 pairs of practical shoes. A warm coat, thermal undergarments. Nothing fashionable, everything functional. Comfort Medical Supply, $89 to $50. A walking cane with ergonomic grip. Compression socks, heat therapy pads. Jason's throat tightened as he continued through the stack. A prepaid phone plan so Judy could receive calls about job applications. Professional alterations for interview clothes. A week's supply of nutritional supplements. Reading glasses. Dental hygiene products. Not one luxury, not one indulgence. Not one item purchased for pleasure rather than need. Then his eyes caught on receipts that made his breath stop entirely. Community Care Foundation, $250,000. Women's Shelter Program, Northside Food Pantry, $200,000. Senior Assistance Fund, Safe Harbor Shelter, £300. Children's Winter Clothing Drive. Jason looked up sharply, the receipts trembling in his hands. "You donated money." Madam Doris held his gaze steadily. "Yes? But you—" Jason's voice cracked slightly. "You had nothing. You needed everything. Why would you give money away?" Madam Doris's expression softened, carrying decades of wisdom in the lines around her eyes. "Because I've lived long enough to know what it feels like to be one missed paycheck away from losing everything, Mr. Richardson. I know what it means to sit in a mall and feel invisible while the world shops around you." She gestured to the receipts in Jason's hands. "If I was trusted with abundance, even briefly, even temporarily, I wasn't about to forget the people still sitting where I sat 2 days ago, still waiting, still hoping someone will remember they're human." Judy's voice joined her mother's, quiet but steady. "She insisted on the donations before we bought anything else, before the coat, before the medicine. She said dignity isn't something you earn when you have money. It's something you prove when you don't." Jason felt something crack in his chest, something that had been calcified for 20 years, hardened by cynicism and betrayal, and his father's endless warnings about human nature's inherent selfishness. "You bought necessities," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Healthcare, stability, nothing wasteful." "At my age," Madam Doris said simply, "comfort is enough. Everything else is just noise." Jason looked at Judy. "And you?" Judy's eyes glistened. "She insisted I get interview clothes, a proper haircut, things that would help me stop just surviving and start rebuilding. But only after she'd made sure others were helped first." Her voice wavered. "That's who she is. That's who she's always been, even when the world acted like she didn't exist." Jason stared at the receipts, physical evidence of choices that dismantled every assumption he'd built his life around. These weren't the actions of people corrupted by sudden access to wealth. These were the actions of people who understood its weight, its responsibility, its potential to mean something beyond personal satisfaction. "I gave you this test," Jason said slowly, the words tasting like confession, "to prove my father's theory. That desperation makes people reckless, that poverty reveals selfishness when given opportunity." Madam Doris tilted her head slightly, understanding crossing her features. "But you didn't prove him right," Jason continued, his throat tight with emotions he'd spent decades suppressing. "You proved me wrong about everything." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Madam Doris reached out and gently touched Jason's arm, the kind of gesture a grandmother makes when wisdom needs to transfer through something more than words. "Perhaps the test wasn't for us at all, young man. Perhaps you needed to see what you'd stopped believing existed." Jason's vision blurred slightly. 20 years of careful cynicism, of protected wealth, of measured distance from human need, all of it crumbling under the weight of receipts totaling less than most people spent on a weekend dinner. He'd designed an experiment to expose greed in others and instead discovered the emptiness in himself. "Come with me," Jason said suddenly, the words emerging before conscious thought could stop them. Judy stiffened. "Where?" Jason met Madam Doris's calm gaze. "Somewhere we can talk properly, somewhere comfortable, just dinner, a real conversation." He paused, vulnerability unfamiliar on his tongue. "Please, I need to understand how you became this person, because I'm not sure I know how to be anything except what my father taught me to be." Madam Doris studied him for a long moment, her weathered face carrying the kind of perception that comes from decades of reading people's true intentions beneath their polished words. Then she nodded slowly. "All right, Mr. Richardson, we'll come." Jason chose a quiet restaurant in Lincoln Park, upscale but not intimidating, the kind of place where conversation mattered more than being seen. The host recognized him immediately, but had the discretion to seat them in a private corner booth without fanfare. Madam Doris slid into the leather seat with practiced grace, while Judy remained slightly tense, her eyes scanning the menu prices with visible anxiety, despite Jason's assurance that nothing was off limits. "Order whatever you'd like," Jason said gently. "Please, this isn't about money tonight." Madam Doris set down her menu and met his eyes. "Then what is it about, Mr. Richardson?" Jason hesitated, surprised by her directness. "Understanding, I think. And maybe penance." "Penance suggests you've done something wrong," Madam Doris observed. "You gave two strangers an extraordinary gift. That's not a sin." "No," Jason agreed quietly. "But spending 20 years believing the worst about people who struggle, that might be." The waiter appeared, breaking the moment's gravity. They ordered simply, Madam Doris choosing salmon, Judy selecting pasta, Jason ordering steak more from habit than appetite. When the waiter left, silence settled over the table like snow, thick but not uncomfortable. "Tell me about your life," Jason said finally, looking at Madam Doris. "Not the recent parts, the beginning, how you became someone who gives away money when you have nothing." Madam Doris's weathered hands folded on the white tablecloth, and for a moment Jason saw decades of labor in the lines of her palms, years of work that left marks no amount of cream could fully erase. "I was a nurse for 41 years, she began, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd seen both miracles and tragedies. "Started when I was 22, finished when my body couldn't handle the 12-hour shifts anymore. I loved that work, loved being useful when people were at their most vulnerable." She paused as water glasses arrived. "My husband, Judy's father, died of a heart attack when Judy was 17. No warning. One moment he was laughing at dinner, the next he was gone. Insurance barely covered the funeral. I learned then that the safety net people talk about has holes big enough to fall through. Judy reached over and squeezed her mother's hand. I raised Judy alone after that, Madam Doris continued. Put her through college working double shifts. Watched her become a talented graphic designer with her own small firm. Pride flickered across her face. Then life happened the way it does. Judy's marriage fell apart, the economy crashed, clients disappeared, medical bills piled up when I got sick. Breast cancer, Judy added quietly, her voice tight. Stage 2. The treatment saved her life, but destroyed our savings. My business couldn't survive when I needed to be at every appointment, every treatment, every moment she needed me. Jason listened, his chest tightening with each revelation. These weren't abstractions. These weren't statistics about poverty and healthcare gaps. These were real fractures in real lives, the kind his wealth insulated him from ever experiencing. I lost the apartment first, Judy continued, staring at her water glass. Then the office space, then my car. Each loss felt like proof I'd failed at being an adult, at being a daughter, at being anything except a burden. You were never a burden, Madam Doris said firmly, the maternal correction reflexive and absolute. You took me back in when I had nothing, Judy whispered. You'd just beaten cancer, you were barely recovered, and I showed up with 2 suitcases and shame. You showed up with love, Madam Doris corrected gently, and that's never been a burden in my house. Jason felt moisture threatening at the corners of his eyes, an unfamiliar sensation that made him grateful for the booth's privacy. How did you end up? He trailed off, unable to finish the question delicately. At the mall? Madam Doris finished for him without judgment. My disability payments stopped due to an administrative error. 3 months of appeals, phone calls, paperwork. Meanwhile, rent came due, then past due, then eviction. She said it matter-of-factly, as if recounting weather patterns rather than catastrophe. We stayed with my sister until her building's owner decided to convert to condos. After that, she shrugged. Shelters when there's space, quiet corners when there isn't. Jason's throat felt raw. You survived cancer, raised a daughter alone, worked for 4 decades saving lives, and the system just abandoned you. The system wasn't designed for people like us, Madam Doris said without bitterness, which somehow made it worse. It was designed for people who never stumble, who never get sick at the wrong time, who never have to choose between medicine and rent. Jason leaned back, his expensive suit suddenly feeling like costume rather than armor. My father always said that people in desperate situations reveal their true character, that they become selfish, grasping, dangerous. And what did we reveal, Mr. Richardson? Madam Doris asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. Jason exhaled slowly. That maybe desperation doesn't corrupt character. It clarifies it. You had every justification to spend recklessly, to finally grasp at comfort after months of suffering. Instead, you thought about others first. You thought about dignity, responsibility, purpose. Because those things don't disappear when your address does, Madam Doris said simply. I didn't stop being a nurse just because I couldn't work anymore. Caring for others isn't a job. It's who I am. Having money for 48 hours didn't change that. It just gave me different tools. The food arrived, and they ate slowly. Conversation flowing naturally between bites. Jason found himself sharing things he'd never articulated, his fear of being exploited, his exhaustion with success that felt hollow, his growing suspicion that his father's philosophy had been less about wisdom and more about justifying emotional distance. Trust is terrifying, Jason admitted, pushing salmon around his plate. Every time I've given it freely, I've been proven a fool. Madam Doris set down her fork and fixed him with a look that was both gentle and unflinching. Or perhaps you gave it to people who hadn't earned it yet, then confused their failures with universal truth. One person's betrayal doesn't mean everyone will betray you, Mr. Richardson. It just means you chose poorly that one time. The simplicity of it struck Jason like a blow. 20 years of cynicism, rooted in maybe 5 or 6 painful experiences that he'd allowed to define his entire worldview. "I want to help you," Jason said suddenly, the words emerging with more force than he intended. "Not as charity, not as some experiment to make myself feel better, but as partnership, mutual investment in what dignity actually looks like." Judy's eyes widened. Madam Doris remained still, studying him carefully. "What does that mean?" Judy asked, hope and fear warring in her voice. Jason leaned forward, ideas crystallizing even as he spoke them. "It means housing, healthcare, stability, but with your agency intact. It means helping Judy rebuild her business with you as advisor. It means treating you both as equals who had bad luck, not charity cases who need saving." He paused, vulnerability cracking his professional composure. "And maybe it means learning from you what my father never taught me, that wealth's real purpose isn't protection, it's connection." Madam Doris's eyes glistened, but her voice remained steady. "Why us? Why now?" "Because you gave me back something I thought I'd lost," Jason said quietly. "The ability to hope that people can be good. Not despite having nothing, but because of what having nothing taught you about what actually matters." Silence settled over the table, heavy with possibility. Then Madam Doris nodded slowly. "Then let's talk about what partnership really means, Mr. Richardson. Because if we do this, we do it right, with respect, boundaries, and no room for either of us to lose ourselves in the process." Jason felt something unlock in his chest, something that had been frozen for 2 decades finally beginning to thaw. "I wouldn't want it any other way." Over coffee, Madam Doris drank hers black, steady hands cradling the ceramic cup. Jason outlined his proposal with the same precision he used in boardroom negotiations, though the stakes felt infinitely higher. "Housing first," he said, pulling out his phone to show property listings his assistant had compiled during dinner. "Nothing extravagant. A 2-bedroom apartment in a safe neighborhood with accessible transit. I'm thinking Rogers Park or Edgewater. Diverse communities, good bones, not isolated." Judy leaned forward to look at the screen, her breath catching at images of clean, modest spaces with natural light and functional kitchens. "Mr. Richardson, this is non-negotiable," Jason interrupted gently. "But with conditions." He looked at Madam Doris. "The lease is in your name. You pay what you can afford, even if that's $50 a month. I cover the difference, but the apartment is yours. You're a tenant, not a dependent. If you decide to leave, you leave. No strings." Madam Doris's eyes narrowed slightly, not with suspicion, but with sharp assessment. "You're trying to preserve my dignity." "I'm trying to offer help the way it should have been offered all along," Jason corrected. "As a bridge, not a cage." "What else?" Madam Doris asked, her tone indicating she was listening but not yet convinced. Jason continued, navigating the delicate territory between generosity and control. "Healthcare coordination. I have contacts at Northwestern Memorial. Real doctors, not emergency room roulette. Consistent care, preventive treatment, specialists when needed. But you choose your own physicians. You make your own medical decisions. I facilitate access, nothing more." "And me?" Judy asked quietly, years of self-sufficiency warring with desperate hope in her voice. Jason turned to her. "You're a graphic designer who lost a business to circumstances, not incompetence. I'm proposing seed capital to restart. New equipment, website, initial marketing budget. But here's the critical part. I'm not an investor expecting returns. I'm a patron creating space for you to rebuild on your own terms. Judy's hands trembled around her coffee cup. That sounds like charity. It sounds like investing in talent the market temporarily failed, Jason countered. You repay me by succeeding, by creating work you're proud of, by proving the system wrong about what happens when capable people catch a break. Nothing more. Madam Doris set down her cup with deliberate care. What do you get from this, Mr. Richardson? Because in my experience, people who give this much want something in return. Control, perhaps. Gratitude performed on demand. The satisfaction of having saved someone. Her directness could have been offensive. Instead, it felt like respect, the kind that demands honesty rather than polite deflection. Jason met her gaze without flinching. I get to stop being the man my father raised me to be. I get to find out if I'm capable of connection without calculation, generosity without contracts, trust without insurance policies protecting my emotional investment. He paused, vulnerability cracking through his professional composure. I built an empire on assuming the worst about people. You proved me wrong in 48 hours. I want to see what happens if I spend the next year assuming the best instead. Silence settled over the table, broken only by the quiet murmur of other diners and the clink of silverware against porcelain. I have conditions, Madam Doris said finally. Jason nodded. I'd be concerned if you didn't. First, we maintain our own lives. We're not your project, your redemption story, or your proof of concept. We're people who accept help but keep our autonomy. Agreed, Jason said immediately. Second, if at any point your help comes with expectations we didn't agree to, if you start treating us like obligations or charity cases, we walk away. No explanations required, no guilt deployed. Fair. Third, Madam Doris's voice softened slightly. You let us help you too. Not with money, with the things money can't buy. Perspective, honesty, the kind of friendship that forms between people who've seen each other's vulnerabilities and chose connection anyway. Jason felt his throat tighten. He'd anticipated many responses: gratitude, suspicion, negotiation. He hadn't anticipated being offered something in return, as if his wealth wasn't the only currency that mattered. I'd like that, he managed quietly. Judy spoke up, her voice wavering but determined. I'm terrified of this. Of depending on someone. Of building something that could collapse if you change your mind or decide we're not worth the investment anymore. Jason understood her fear intimately. It was his own fear reflected back at him, the terror of trusting when trust had previously been weaponized. Then let's be terrified together, he said. I'm scared too. Scared I'll mess this up. Scared I'll revert to old patterns. Scared I'll prove my father right after all and discover that trust was foolish all along. But you're choosing it anyway, Madam Doris observed. Yes, Jason said simply. Because the alternative, spending the rest of my life behind walls I built from other people's failures, feels like a different kind of death. Madam Doris reached across the table and placed the black credit card between them one final time. Then we're choosing it too, Mr. Richardson. But this stays with you. We don't need unlimited access to your wealth. We just need enough space to remember who we were before the world decided we were disposable. Jason stared at the card, the instrument of his experiment, now transformed into something closer to covenant. He picked it up slowly, feeling its weight differently than he had 3 days ago. When can you move? He asked, practicality anchoring the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Give us a week, Judy said, glancing at her mother. To process this, to make sure it's real. And to make sure you're real, Madam Doris added with a slight smile. Trust works both directions, young man. Jason smiled back, a genuine expression that felt unfamiliar on his face. 1 week. I'll have my assistant coordinate everything, but the decisions are yours, every step. As they prepared to leave, Jason reached for the check, only to find Madam Doris had already placed 2 $20 bills on the table, her contribution to a meal that cost 10 times that amount. Dignity, she said simply, catching his surprised expression, means paying your own way whenever possible.
Even when someone else could easily cover it. Jason left the bills there, understanding the gesture's importance, even as his wealth rendered the amount meaningless. Walking them to the car he'd arranged, Jason felt something shift in his chest. Something that had been frozen since his father's death, maybe longer. Trust wasn't the weakness he'd been taught to avoid. It was the muscle he'd let atrophy until a silver-haired woman with worn shoes taught him how to use it again. "Thank you," he said as they prepared to leave. Madam Doris squeezed his hand gently. "Don't thank us yet, Mr. Richardson. The hard part comes next, actually changing. Talk is easy. Action is where we discover who we really are." As the car pulled away, Jason stood on the sidewalk, his reflection visible in the restaurant's window, a billionaire who'd given away nothing except assumptions and received everything he'd been missing. 6 months would tell whether this experiment in trust would hold, or whether his father's ghost would prove right after all. 6 months passed like water finding new channels, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum that reshaped everything it touched. Jason stood in the doorway of Judy's new studio space in Wicker Park, watching her present design concepts to a local non-profit client. Her voice carried confidence he hadn't heard that first day at the mall, steady, professional, animated with the kind of passion that comes from work that matters. Her laptop displayed clean, elegant branding for a women's job training program. The client nodded enthusiastically, already reaching for contracts. "She's good," Madam Doris said quietly beside Jason, maternal pride evident in every syllable. "She always was," Jason replied. "She just needed the world to stop punishing her for stumbling." The apartment in Rogers Park had transformed from empty space into home, not luxurious. Madam Doris had refused anything that felt excessive, but warm, lived in. Plants on windowsills, photos on walls, a kitchen that smelled like real cooking instead of takeout containers. Judy paid $200 monthly toward rent, a symbolic amount that preserved dignity even as Jason covered the remaining $1,600. The difference mattered more than the mathematics. But the real transformation happened in ways Jason hadn't anticipated. 3 months in, Madam Doris had approached him with a proposal that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with purpose. She wanted to volunteer at the women's shelter, where she'd sometimes stayed during those 5 months of homelessness, not as someone rescued and grateful, but as someone who understood what the women there were experiencing because she'd lived it. "I can teach them what the system won't," she'd said, her weathered hands steady around her teacup as they sat in her modest kitchen. "How to navigate bureaucracy, how to maintain dignity when the world treats you as invisible, how to be homeless without becoming hopeless." Jason had connected her with the shelter director. Within weeks, Madam Doris was running weekly sessions, part support group, part practical training, part something that couldn't be named but felt like resurrection. Women decades younger than her listened with the intensity of students who'd found a professor who actually understood their curriculum. Jason attended one session, sitting quietly in the back. He watched Madam Doris guide a young mother through the paperwork maze of disability applications, her patience infinite, her knowledge hard-earned. He watched her hold the hand of a woman in her 50s who'd lost everything to medical debt, offering not platitudes, but presence. "You're not broken," Madam Doris had said to that woman, her voice carrying the authority of lived truth. "The system is broken. You're just caught in its machinery.
but machinery can be navigated when you know where the gears are. Afterward, walking to his car, Jason had found his vision blurred with tears he didn't try to hide. This wasn't the rescue fantasy his ego had imagined. This was something far more powerful, someone using her own trauma as medicine for others, transforming suffering into service. His relationship with both women had evolved beyond anything resembling benefactor and recipients. Thursday dinners became routine, sometimes at restaurants, often at Madam Doris's apartment where she insisted on cooking. Jason found himself laughing more than he had in years, listening to Judy's stories about difficult clients, hearing Madam Doris's observations about human nature that were wiser than anything his business school professors had offered. "You're different," his assistant remarked one afternoon, reviewing quarterly reports. "Lighter, somehow."
"Less miserable?" Jason supplied with a slight smile. "I was going to say isolated, but yes, that too." Jason's professional life hadn't changed dramatically. He still ran Richardson Technologies with the same competence that had built his fortune. But his approach had shifted. He found himself asking different questions during investment meetings. Who benefits from this beyond shareholders? What happens to the employees if this fails? Are we creating value or just extracting it? His board noticed. Some approved, others worried he'd gone soft. Jason didn't care. For the first time in 20 years, he was measuring success by metrics that couldn't be graphed on quarterly earnings reports. One evening, sitting in Madam Doris's living room while Judy showed him her latest client portfolio, Jason articulated something that had been crystallizing for months. "I want to start something," he said, setting down his coffee cup. "A foundation, maybe, or a program, something focused on people like you, capable, talented, temporarily knocked down by circumstances that shouldn't be fatal." Judy looked up from her laptop. Madam Doris set aside the book she'd been reading, her expression thoughtful. "What kind of program?" Madam Doris asked. Jason leaned forward, ideas spilling out faster than he could organize them. "Something that addresses intergenerational poverty differently. Mother-daughter partnerships, grandmother-mother-daughter support systems, not just giving money, but creating networks of mutual aid. Women who've survived helping women currently struggling. Skills training, yes, but also mentorship, community, dignity." "That's ambitious," Judy said carefully, "and potentially controversial. People don't like being reminded that poverty isn't always about personal failure." "I know," Jason said, "which is why I need you both involved, not as symbols or poster examples of success stories, as architects, partners, co-creators who understand what actually helps because you've lived what actually hurts." Madam Doris studied him with those penetrating eyes that had seen through his pretenses from the first moment. "This isn't about redemption for you anymore, is it?" Jason considered the question honestly. "Maybe it started that way, but now it's about believing there are thousands of women like you who just need someone to remember they're human, that their circumstances aren't character judgments." Silence settled over the room, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the hum of Judy's laptop cooling fan. "When would you announce this?" Judy asked, hope and concern mingling in her voice. Jason took a breath, feeling the weight of vulnerability he'd been avoiding his entire professional life. "I'm thinking the annual Richardson Technologies Benefit Gala. 300 of Chicago's wealthiest donors, maximum visibility, impossible to retreat from once announced." Madam Doris's eyebrows rose. "You're going public with this? With us?" "Yes," Jason said simply. "If you're willing, because the story isn't complete if I'm the only one telling it. This only works if people understand that the women we're trying to help aren't abstractions. They're you. They're real, capable, deserving of more than pity." Judy looked at her mother, a silent conversation passing between them in the way only mothers and daughters can communicate without words. Finally,
Madam Doris nodded slowly. "Then let's do it properly, Mr. Richardson. Let's show them what transformation actually looks like when it's built on trust instead of charity." Jason felt his heart rate accelerate, not with fear, but with something closer to purpose. In 2 weeks, he would stand in front of Chicago's elite and announce a program that challenged everything his father had taught him about wealth, poverty, and human nature. And standing beside him would be 2 women who'd taught him that sometimes the greatest return on investment has nothing to do with money at all. The ballroom of the Drake Hotel glittered with the kind of wealth that made itself comfortable in gilded spaces. 300 guests in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos filled tables adorned with centerpieces that cost more than most families spent on groceries in a month. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across faces Jason had known for years. Investors, executives, philanthropists who measured generosity in tax deductions and naming rights. Jason stood backstage, adjusting his bow tie with hands that trembled slightly despite decades of public speaking experience. His keynote address sat heavy in his jacket pocket, though he'd already memorized every word. "You don't have to do this," Judy said quietly beside him, elegant in a simple black dress she'd designed herself. Her portfolio had grown to 15 clients in 6 months. Tonight wasn't charity, it was partnership. "Yes, I do," Jason replied, looking past the curtain to where Madam Doris sat at the front table, her silver hair styled simply, wearing a dress of deep emerald that carried dignity without pretension. She caught his eye and nodded once, steady, assured, ready. The MC's voice boomed across the sound system. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jason Richardson, founder and CEO of Richardson Technologies." Jason walked onto the stage to polite applause, the spotlight momentarily blinding. He gripped the podium, looking out at faces that expected the usual gala speech, grateful acknowledgements, impressive statistics about philanthropic impact, perhaps an announcement about a new wing at the children's hospital bearing the Richardson name. Instead, Jason began with a confession. "6 months ago, I conducted an experiment," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos of his heartbeat. "I gave my credit card, unlimited, unrestricted, to a homeless woman and her daughter in a shopping mall. I walked away for 48 hours with no rules, no oversight, no protection." The audience stirred, curiosity rippling through the room like wind across water. "I did it to test something my father taught me," Jason continued. "That desperation reveals selfishness, that poverty strips away character, that people with nothing given everything will take until there's nothing left." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I expected to prove him right, to confirm what I'd spent 20 years believing about human nature." He gestured toward the front table. "Instead, those 2 women taught me I'd spent 20 years being catastrophically wrong. Madam Doris." "Judy, would you please join me?" The audience turned as Madam Doris and Judy walked toward the stage with unhurried grace. Not performing gratitude or rescue narratives, simply present, equal, undiminished by circumstances that could have broken them. Jason handed the microphone to Madam Doris. She held it with steady hands, surveying the room with eyes that had seen wealth and poverty and understood that neither defined a person's worth. "When Mr. Richardson gave me his credit card," she began, her voice carrying the quiet authority of lived wisdom, "I didn't see opportunity for revenge against a world that had forgotten me. I saw responsibility. Because abundance, even temporary, even borrowed, comes with the obligation to remember those still waiting for someone to see their humanity." She outlined what she and Judy had done with those 48 hours. Not as a defense, but as testimony. The essentials purchased, the donations made, the choices rooted in dignity rather than desperation. "We didn't transform because of money,"
Madam Doris said, her gaze sweeping the room. We transformed because someone finally offered trust without conditions, and that recognition of our full humanity was worth more than anything on any receipt. Jason took the microphone back, his throat tight with emotion. Tonight, I'm announcing the establishment of the Dignity First Foundation, not a charity that processes applications and distributes checks, a partnership program that connects women across generations, grandmothers, mothers, daughters, in mutual support networks. Women who've survived mentoring women currently struggling, practical training combined with the kind of wisdom that only comes from experience. He looked at Madam Doris and Judy. These two women won't be our success story poster images. They'll be program architects, decision makers, partners who ensure we never forget that the people we're trying to help aren't abstractions or statistics. They're talented, capable human beings whose circumstances temporarily obscured their worth. The applause started slowly, then built, genuine rather than perfunctory, moved rather than obligatory. After the formal presentation, after the networking and congratulations and inevitable skeptics questioning his business judgment, Jason found Madam Doris and Judy on the hotel's terrace overlooking Lake Michigan. The water stretched dark and infinite, city lights reflecting on its surface like scattered stars. "You did it," Judy said, squeezing his arm gently. "You actually changed the conversation." Jason shook his head. "You changed me first. This is just the aftershock." Madam Doris stood at the railing, her silhouette elegant against the night. Jason joined her, both of them quiet for a long moment. "Do you remember what you said that first day?" Jason asked finally. "That if you accepted the card, it wouldn't be for foolishness." Madam Doris smiled slightly. "I remember. I've been thinking about what I said, that I wanted to test whether my father was right about people, whether desperation made them dangerous." Jason's voice roughened. "But the truth is, I was testing myself, trying to find out if I was capable of trust, of connection, of being someone other than the cynical man he raised." "And what did you discover?" Madam Doris asked gently. Jason looked out at the water, thinking about transactions and receipts, about groceries and donations, about the moments that didn't appear on any credit card statement but changed everything. That trust, when placed in the right hands, doesn't disappear. It multiplies. It grows into something neither person could have created alone. Madam Doris turned to face him, her weathered face carrying decades of wisdom earned through suffering and endurance and refusal to let circumstances define her worth. "Then perhaps the test succeeded after all, Mr. Richardson, just not in the way you expected." "Jason," he corrected quietly. "After 6 months, I think we've earned first names." She smiled, warm, genuine, the kind of expression that held no calculation or performance. "Jason, then." 3 weeks later, Jason found himself back at that same mall, walking through corridors that had witnessed the beginning of his transformation. He passed the seating area where he'd first seen them, the spot now occupied by a young family eating ice cream, unaware of its significance. He didn't stop, didn't linger in nostalgia, just acknowledged silently that some spaces hold memories that change trajectories, that redirect entire lives with moments that feel ordinary until hindsight reveals their weight. His phone buzzed with a message from Judy. "First cohort of mentor matches complete. 10 grandmother-daughter pairs starting next week. Mum's leading orientation. This is really happening." Jason smiled, typing back, "Because we trusted it could." Walking back into the Chicago sunlight, Jason Richardson, billionaire, venture capitalist, man who'd spent 20 years believing the worst about human nature, finally understood what Madam Doris had known all along.
That wealth's greatest return wasn't measured in dollars multiplied or assets accumulated. It was measured in moments when two strangers chose trust over cynicism, connection over fear, and in doing so, proved that transformation was possible for everyone brave enough to risk believing in it. The credit card sat in his wallet, unchanged. But everything it represented had been revolutionized by a silver-haired woman who'd shown him that dignity doesn't require money. It just requires someone willing to see it, honor it, and trust it to guide the way forward.